Hope your week is off to a good start. I'm Min Sun-hee with our group of foreign journalists. Welcome to the show.
Good to be back, thanks.
Now, as always, let's begin with a few words on some of the stories that caught your attention. We'll start with you, Don.
Well, of course, the big story is the standoff over the North Korea's nuclear program. The U.S. and South Korea opened up war games last week. At the same time, while Kim Jong-un did seem to put off the idea of test firing a missile in the waters near Guam, he also took great pride in looking over a new missile at a chemical factory and talking about the need to develop missiles and work on nuclear technology. So we have mixed signals from North Korea, but things could be worse. They could be firing missiles in the direction of Guam, and they don't seem to be doing that.
Right, Koichi, what about you?
A similar issue, but a couple of days ago, Kim Jong-un shows some panel behind him that says brand new ballistic missiles called Pugukson 3 and Hwason 13. I think it shows that they are still planning to do some missile launches in near future, so that was a big story.
Frank?
I've been covering the same thing as these guys, the standoff between Washington and Pyongyang, and looking especially at signals that the U.S. might be looking for negotiations. Comments from Secretary of State Rex Tillerson that he suggested North Korea was showing restraint in that it hadn't engaged in a missile or nuclear test while the South Korea-U.S. military exercises, Ulchi Freedom Guardian, are ongoing. So we may see some movement, perhaps after the military drills are over, towards some type of negotiations, perhaps between some officials from the U.S. and North Korea.
Hopefully. Right, well, just last week, Seoul and Beijing marked the silver anniversary, if I may, of diplomatic ties. Now, compared to previous celebrations, the event this year was commemorated on a rather sober note amid the fallout from THAAD. We have details up next.
On August 24th, Korea and China marked the 25th anniversary of establishing diplomatic ties. The establishment of these ties marked a new chapter in history. Korea-China ties have noted significant growth. Among the growth is that of the economic arena. In 1992, the trade volume between the two countries was at about $6.4 billion. But by 2016, it stood at more than $2.1 trillion. That's a 33-fold increase in 24 years. In addition, as of 2016, China became the #1 export and import partner of Korea, whereas Korea became the #1 import partner of China. The number of people visiting each other's country has also increased. The number of people visiting Korea and China for sightseeing, studying, business and medical care stands at over 11 million. That's about 120 times more than what it was in 1992, when it stood at 90,000. Each country is also among the others' top tourist destinations. Also playing a pivotal part in promoting bilateral exchanges is the presence of Hallyu or Korean Wave. There's been a revolutionary change in popular culture exchange between Korea and China, as the Hallyu Wave has continued in drama, music, movies, fashion, cosmetics, food and games. In this edition of Foreign Correspondents, we explore the 25 years of diplomatic ties between Korea and China.
In simple terms, how would you describe ties between Seoul and Beijing, Don?
Well, I think that they're basically good, believe it or not, despite THAAD. Of course, there's enormous trade between China and Korea, and there's enormous Korean investment in China, very important investment. So I would say mostly they're good, but they're complicated, as we all know, by THAAD. The question is whether or not China will lay off its recriminations over THAAD, get over it, let's say. Nobody's going to be firing any counter missiles. North Korea is not going to be firing any missiles at South Korea, in my opinion. And I would hope that THAAD would gradually fade into history. But that's certainly a complicating factor. But overall, I think the relations between South Korea and China are quite good.
How do you regard the relationship?
Yeah, it's same. It's mutual beneficial relationship, China and Korea. But recently, because of that, their tension is getting more higher.
Do you also have a positive
Well,
view?
I agree with these guys. I think that there are sort of areas of concern in relations between China and South Korea. As Don mentioned, of course, there's tremendous trade. The economic development of trade between the two countries is really unprecedented over the last 25 years. But looking at some other issues, some political issues, you could say that things are a little bit more contentious. You have Beijing, essentially funding some historical institutes in China that regard large swaths of traditionally Korean territory as part of China. And then you have a little bit of controversy over the air zones intersecting between the two countries in Eodo, an island or potential island claimed by South Korea that's also claimed by China. So you do have these sort of spheres of contention in relations between China and South Korea, but still looking at the economic relationship, aside from the controversy over THAAD, things are certainly very good between the two countries.
They were formally established in 1992, Koichi. What do you believe paved the path to such progress in ties between the two countries back then?
First of all, the Cold War has ended, and after that, both North and South Korea became a member of the United Nations. And at the same time, China started opening up a reform policy, and then later Deng Xiaoping was claiming that they need development, so they need assistance from foreign country. And that's naturally China want to learn from South Korea's experience and need investment and skills. So that is, I think, basic background of the normalization of two countries.
I think we can even go back a little bit further to the 70s when China was opened up by the Americans, Henry Kissinger and Richard Nixon, as a watershed moment in China's development and international opening. And that really paved the way, I think, for eventual recognition and diplomatic ties between South Korea and China. And of course, South Korea's position as an ally of the United States, it would have been somewhat awkward for South Korea to maintain its then status in terms of Taiwan. And yet have this relationship with the United States and its recognition of Beijing.
It happens that I was in Seoul 25 years ago, believe it or not, when this transition occurred. I remember going to the Chinese embassy, that is the Republic of China, the Taiwan embassy, and listening to a great press conference and expressions of grief and disappointment and so forth. However, this was the era of Nordpolitik, which was the policy of then President Roh Tae-woo. And this was all part of opening up to Eastern Bloc in Europe, Soviet Union, now the former Soviet Union, and also opening up to China. It was just a matter of being realistic. And also, of course, the Chinese were not that happy even then with North Korea, and South Korea wanted to strike up a warm relationship with Beijing, partly to offset the problems with North Korea. So that was also a factor. Many factors came together. It was absolutely inevitable, since the U.S. had formed relations with China, that South Korea also would do so, along with many other countries.
Would you say these ties are beneficial, mutually beneficial, Frank?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, again, you put it that, you look at the economic development that's taken place between the two countries now, looking at the tourism sector, although that's taking a little bit of a hit from THAAD, something like nearly 50% of South Koreans' tourism sector is Chinese tourists coming to South Korea to visit the country. So just, that one area. And then, as Don mentioned, you have tremendous investment of South Korean companies in China. China is a behemoth. It's a huge country, 1.4 billion people. Just developing trade and economic relations with China is going to be a tremendous boost for the South Korean economy, and has been over the last 25 years, and will be, for the next perhaps century at least. Just developing that relationship has been very beneficial to South Korea, and it's likely to continue.
In early July, during their summit talks, Presidents Moon Jae-in and Xi Jinping reaffirmed their commitment to promoting peace on the Korean Peninsula and to promoting their strategic partnership. What are your thoughts on this, Frank?
Well, I think, Moon Jae-in has a very difficult task ahead of him. You're seeing really a shift in sort of power in East Asia a little bit. China's economy is still growing at an incredible rate. It's developing its military quite a bit. It's posing a little bit of a challenge to the United States for regional hegemony, if you want to call it that. At the same time, South Korea, of course, relies on the United States as a security guarantor, and yet sees its economic relationship with China, again, developing quite swiftly. Balancing those interests is something that Moon Jae-in is going to have to do quite deftly to prevent, again, the THAAD issue from taking a bigger bite out of the South Korean economy than one would wish, and putting that onto maybe a different track than the main relationship, and of course the diplomatic relationship of the leaders of the two countries at least.
As mentioned earlier, Seoul's decision to deploy THAAD here on the peninsula has caused quite a bit of a friction between Seoul and Beijing. Koichi, do you expect this to improve anytime soon in the near future?
Well, I think to start improving relationship, I think Korean government should finish this THAAD issue. I mean, it's still ongoing issue, right? Just there are 4 launchers is supposed to be going to that base, and it's not completed. So I think Korean government should speed up this process, and if after finishing it, South Korea and China can start restoring this relationship.
Well, before we delve any further into our discussion today on Seoul's diplomatic ties with Beijing, we take a look at the fallout amid Seoul's decision to deploy an advanced missile defense system here in the country.
Korea and China have held commemorative ceremonies to mark their diplomatic relations every 5 years since 1992. However, this year, the 25th year of diplomatic relations, the two countries held their celebrations separately. This reality reflects the current tensions between the two countries. Korea and China have maintained and developed cooperative relations in various fields, such as economy, society and culture, since August 1992. However, when the South Korean government finally decided to deploy the THAAD system on the Korean peninsula in response to North Korea's security threats in July of last year, relations between Seoul and Beijing turned cold. China has opposed the THAAD deployment on the Korean peninsula, claiming that the THAAD radar will infringe on the security of its own country. Then on February 27th, when the THAAD placement site was finalized, China disclosed strong statements in opposition to the move. However, it is not easy for China to objectively oppose the THAAD deployment. That's because North Korea's missile provocation continues. The persistent provocations of North Korea has put the Korean peninsula in a state of high tension. On July 29th, when North Korea launched an ICBM-level missile, the Chinese Foreign Ministry strongly criticized North Korea. In addition, on August 6th, at the ASEAN Regional Security Forum, China demanded that North Korea end its missile launches as well as its nuclear ambitions. On the same day, the UN Security Council passed a sanction resolution against North Korea to block its exports and financial resources.
产业方面，要冷静对待刚刚出台的联合国安理会的设查的决议，不要再做有违 安理会决议和国际社会意愿的。
China also imposed import bans on North Korea's coal, iron, and seafood, but it has yet to stop supplying crude oil to North Korea. The US hopes that China, which accounts for 90% of North Korea's trade and is a major supplier of oil and food, will work further to promote peace on the Korean peninsula. However, experts predict that the THAAD deployment issue will make it difficult for China to actively pursue the North Korea issue. Time will tell what the future holds for the two countries, Korea and China, amid their current dispute over THAAD.
What are the chances, in your view, of Seoul revoking its decision to deploy THAAD, Don?
I don't think Seoul is now going to revoke that decision. President Moon was certainly not enthusiastic about it while he was campaigning for president. It was a deal that was made by his predecessor, the ousted and jailed Park Geun-hye. But nonetheless, I think now that it's there, he's just as soon leave it there, and he'll probably want to get these 4 final launchers installed too. I think the President Moon would like to see it fade away rather than take some precipitous action, either increasing the number of counter-missile batteries or removing this one. I think he just would like to let this one stay where it is and then go on from there.
I agree with definitely. I think it would be beneficial for the relations between China and South Korea to move on. And in order to move on, the decision has to be made. It has to be completed. The deployment has to be finished. I don't see Seoul reversing that at all, regardless of the economic repercussions that China might levy on South Korea. It would be a big mistake to let a security issue for South Korea be influenced by some economic concerns or relations with Beijing.
During an interview in early July with state-run Xinhua news agency, Chinese leader Xi Jinping claimed the deployment of THAAD gravely harms the strategic security interests of both China and Russia. Don, how do you respond to this?
Well, I think that that's a bit of an exaggeration. He's indulging in hyperbole. There seems to be some view that THAAD's radar devices are such that they can really tell what the Chinese are doing all over China and where China is deploying missiles and what its plannings are. And again, but there are a lot of other ways to see what's going on. There are satellites, there are planes with great radar devices on them that fly around, and there are plenty of other listening devices to see what's happening in China. I'm not saying that that doesn't have a great capacity, but I don't think that it's nearly as much of a menace to Chinese security as made out by some Chinese leaders and commentators.
I think Beijing is also looking at where is this going? Where do we draw a red line in terms of U.S. Militarization of the region? If look at the naval base on Jeju Island. That U.S. vessels now have access to this new naval base that's again closer to China, that gives it greater access to the South China Sea. Certainly Beijing is going to be concerned about that. THAAD is another thing that they're going to be concerned about. Perhaps the U.S. will engage in further military development of the region that would again draw the ire of Beijing and Moscow. So they're trying to draw some perhaps red line here to say, okay, hold on a second. At the same time, we need to look at some of the other technical capabilities of THAAD. One of the purposes of THAAD, of course, is to defend against incoming missiles in the region it's in. Another one is to connect to the U.S. global missile defense using its radar system. It will give an earlier warning and better capabilities of the U.S. to track missiles launched from various countries, including China and Russia. And that's another reason that I think China is so opposed to its deployment here.
Beijing called on Pyongyang to halt its nuclear tests as well as missile launches. Do you believe this is an indication that China is taking on perhaps a more assertive role in trying to resolve tensions on the peninsula, Koichi?
Well, I think looking at the recent UN resolution, I think China is doing quite good job, but I don't think it works when it comes to North Korea to discard their nuclear weapons, it would be a long, long way.
Well, China's not going to get North Korea to discard its nuclear weapons. However, I do think the strong words of the Chinese at the ASEAN Forum and in other settings may have had some effect. After all, Kim Jong-un did pull back on the idea of launching a missile near Guam. Now, some people say, well, that was because of President Trump's threatening fire and fury and so forth. But also, China may also have been conveying the word to North Korea diplomatically through its embassy and through statements such as that at ASEAN, that we simply cannot have this kind of threat, this kind of menace going on. It's upsetting the whole region. So stop it, and we're going to we're going to follow through on abiding by UN sanctions, which is something that China really hasn't done so scrupulously in the past.
I agree with Don, but at the same time, China has also called for a freeze of the large-scale U.S.-South Korea military drills, coupled with a freeze. It was a freeze-for-freeze proposal that they had given, and I think the U.S. is perhaps hearing that proposal. Comments from Secretary of State Rex Tillerson that he suggested North Korea was showing restraint, I think really tell that the U.S., that Washington is looking for some type of new path in terms of developing engagement with North Korea.
Chinese government has also called for the resumption of six-party nuclear talks. Now, as of the end of 2008, I believe, there have been a total of 10 such meetings among the two Koreas, China, Japan, Russia, and the United States. Koichi, how effective do you suppose these talks are?
Well, at least six-party talks made some sort of achievement. They had agreed in 2005, I guess, and for verifiable denuclearization in Peninsula. So, and also, there is no other way, otherwise dialogue. So, I think we should restart six-party talks in near future, but still I can't be so optimistic because, at the point of 2005 and 2008, North Korean nuclear weapons level was not so high, but right now their missile and nuclear weapons technology is quite very sophisticated now. So.
Right. This will be probably a last question, but how do you foresee future ties between Seoul and Beijing? Koichi, will start with you.
Well, eventually that relationship goes better. But honestly speaking, it will be different. These 25 years, I think from my perspective, Korea was in a very lucky position because China wants to learn from Korea and need investment. So, of course, there should be a happy relationship. But now, China is a very strong country and one of the superpower, definitely, strongest power in this region. So, from me, naturally, China become a little bit bossy in this area. Then, of course, the relationship with these countries are naturally a bit difficult. Yeah.
Frank, how do you foresee bilateral ties between Seoul and Beijing in the near future?
I think they're going to continue to get better. I think THAAD will be put on the back burner. They'll get over that pretty soon. South Korea will maintain the U.S. as its security guarantor in the region, and China's economic development will help the South Korean economy develop further. I really don't see other serious issues on the horizon for South Korea-Chinese relations.
Right, well, Seoul and Beijing have made remarkable advances in diplomatic ties over the past 25 years, and as over that time period, the two countries have become strategic cooperative partners with the economic exchanges surging 30-fold and cultural exchanges surging 70-fold. Now, keeping this in reality in mind, we hope that there'll be more growth in the very near future. Thank you for watching.